This is a film about change. And more specifically, it's about how change that happens fast creates problems.
Fire!
Throughout history, mankind has often had to confront technologies that grew so powerful so quickly that they threatened to outrun any attempt to govern them. Each time, the world reorganised itself, and each time it survived, often enriched by these new technologies like the printing press, electricity, or powered flight. But sometimes, the margin of survival was a finger hovering over a button.
Stand by. Shoot!
Now we are faced with another new technology. And the debate that is raging around artificial intelligence is simply, can we get ahead of it? Or will it get ahead of us? But this film is not about that question. Instead, it is about the answer. This film is about 3 points across the last 70 years, where diplomats chose the hope of the future over the promises of the present. And because they did, humans still exist.
In October 1957, the world entered the space age. As each rocket stage burned out, the next one fired. The last one launched the world's first artificial satellite called the Sputnik 1. The early satellites, both Russian and American, confirmed the work of scientists in many parts of the world.
Officially, it was a scientific satellite carrying instruments to measure the atmosphere. But those in the know understood the true implication. For the first time, a rocket could launch a weapon into orbit. The general's hope, and the layman's fear, was a nuclear warhead circling the Earth, capable of delivering its payload with less than 5 minutes of warning. It would bypass any missile defence, and early warning systems would be useless against it. The logic for creating such a weapon was overwhelming. If you got there first, you won a huge strategic advantage. For nearly a decade, the superpowers had raced towards this goal. But then, the politics turned. By the early 1960s, the United Nations had begun to argue that space should belong to no one, that no nation could claim the moon, and no weapon of mass destruction should orbit the Earth. The push did not originally come from Washington or Moscow. It came from the floor of the General Assembly, where India, Mexico, Brazil, and a coalition of newly independent states had been arguing for years that space was the celestial inheritance of all mankind, not a prize for two superpowers. In 1963, the General Assembly adopted that principle unanimously.
International Conference on the Exploration and Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
The Outer Space Treaty opened for signature in January 1967. More than 60 nations signed within weeks, and to this day, no nuclear weapon has ever been placed in orbit. Although nuclear weapons in space were off limits, it didn't end mankind's search for novel weapons.
Good morning. Here's the news. Civil Defense Headquarters announced today that the sharp increase in the number of cases of illness during the last few days have led authorities to suspect that a biological warfare attack may have taken place.
By the late 1960s, the United States had spent over 2 decades building the most sophisticated biological weapons program in human history. Anthrax, botulism, bioengineered wheat fungus which could destroy grain harvests across the Soviet Union. American scientists were proud of the progress that they'd made with these weapons, and the generals who oversaw them were adamant that they were essential. And then, on the 25th of November 1969, Richard Nixon brought it all to an end.
I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
What's more amazing about this is that the order didn't come from public pressure. There were no placards on Pennsylvania Avenue. It came instead from inside the system. A Defense Department review found that biological weapons offered no military advantage that nuclear weapons didn't already provide, and that it opened up another front for proliferation. Nixon read the assessments and shut the program down. The British had already tabled a draft convention at Geneva in July 1969. After Nixon's announcement, that draft became the basis of negotiation, and for 2 years, in a conference room at the Palais des Nations, diplomats from around the world argued the language of the agreement line by line. The Biological Weapons Convention opened for signature on the 10th of April 1972. It was the first multilateral treaty in history to ban an entire class of weapons. It's not just in the realm of weaponry where diplomats delivered compelling acts.
Here's how to keep your hair in shining order with Liquinet. When your curls are just the way you want them, float on a cloud of Liquinet. Liquinet keeps your hair in place perfectly. Liquinet, the invisible liquid hairnet.
In 1974, 2 chemists at the University of California published a paper that was met with derision and laughter across the world. Unfortunately, it was correct. Melina and Rowland had discovered where chlorofluorocarbons went when they were dispersed. CFCs were the miracle chemicals of the post-war world. They were inert and harmless to humans. Consequently, they were in everything. Every aerosol can, every fridge, every air conditioning unit. The science Melina and Rowland had done showed that the molecules drifted into the stratosphere, where ultraviolet light broke them apart and released chlorine. A single chlorine atom could destroy 100,000 ozone molecules, and the ozone layer was what prevented ultraviolet light from sterilizing the surface of the planet. The reaction to the paper was instant. DuPont, which manufactured a quarter of the world's CFCs, called it science fiction. In 1985, 3 scientists at a remote British base in Antarctica measured a hole in the atmosphere the size of an entire continent. As has been seen elsewhere, when scientists present compelling scientific data, no matter how popular it may or may not be, it takes diplomatic efforts to deliver the real-world change. With CFCs, Mustafa Tolba, who ran the UN Environment Programme, drove the negotiations forward. Richard Benedict, the chief American negotiator, pushed his own delegation harder than Washington had authorized, because he believed the science and suspected that history would forgive him. It did. The Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987, and every nation on Earth has now ratified it, the only UN treaty in history to achieve that honour. DuPont abandoned CFCs within a few years, and the latest projections are that by 2065, the ozone layer will have fully recovered. These 3 moments are not the same. They are separated by decades and disciplines. In each case, there was change. There was technology moving faster than the politics could cope with. People who were paying attention did the work to see what would happen if they didn't act. so they acted. Once again, we find ourselves confronted by a technology that could enrich our species and provide real benefits. Or it could not. The science has been done. The array of risks AI confronts us with is stark to contemplate. We see the same void that Nixon once contemplated. It's the moment that Richard Benedict understood and realised that history expected him to be decisive. It's why nations found the strength to agree. If we want to take the better path for AI's development, then we find ourselves looking to scientists, diplomats, and governments once again. Progress is already underway. Scientists are sounding the alert about the problems with AI's future. States have already called on the UN General Assembly for a treaty. But the work on what that treaty looks like and how it gets implemented is waiting for states to take up the challenge. To explore how, go to www.global-governance.ai.